Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CGHE Seminar 232, the 14 CG's Racism and Coloniality in Global Higher Education webinar series. I'm Xinxu from CG Oxford, and today we're honored to hear from Professor Arathi Sriprakash from Bristol University on learning whiteness, material, epistemic and affective relations of higher education. So before we hand over to Arathi, here's some housekeeping issues. So please note that this Zoom webinar is being recorded and will be posted online and on CG website. And the transcript of the chat function will also be posted in the same website. And then for all the audience, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. And there's no need to turn your video on during the webinar, but please do so when you're asking a question. We recommend you to use the speaker's view so that you can see clearly who is speaking. And to ask a question, please use the chat function and write out your question you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, I'll select the questions, and if you're invited to ask a question, please turn your camera on, unmute yourself, and introduce who you are and where you're from. And today we have a very special mode of webinar and seminar. So we have quite a few audiences with us in the seminar room, and we also have more than 30 audiences joining us online now. So welcome everyone. We appreciate everyone attending online and on-site. So if you notice us speaking from the Zoom, from the room, looking other directions, please bear with us for a moment. And so without further ado, now I will hand over to Arathi. So Arathi, the screen and the floor are both yours.
Great, thank you so much, Shin, as well as David, Natasha, Trevor, everyone who was behind getting me along to Oxford today and putting on this fantastic webinar series, and welcome everyone who's listening in. It'd be lovely to see where you're all from. So, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, where you are. I can see some familiar names, which I'm very excited to see, some colleagues, but also some former students. Hello, Bali, I saw you there. So really lovely to see you here. My presentation today is based on a book that I've been working on with my colleagues, Sophie, Rudolph and Jessica Gerrard, who are both at the University of Melbourne. I wanted to start by acknowledging that the research and writing for this work, the book is called Learning Whiteness, and it'll be published by Pluto Press early next year. The research and writing took place in part on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Wurrung people, and this is land that has never been ceded. My co-authors and I are working in academic institutions which sit on stolen land in Australia, in their case, and in the heart of empire in England, in my case, and which are, as I'll be discussing today, complicit in sustaining what we're calling whiteness, systems of racial domination around white supremacy. So we came to actually writing the book to reckon with these tensions, being part of an education system that has been so thoroughly implicated in systems of racial domination. To consider the very idea and practice of education that we're enmeshed in order to imagine ways of fundamentally remaking it. So I hope that there are aspects of this presentation that perhaps you're able to connect with and fill out based on your own context that you're listening in from and your experiences in higher education as well. What I'll be presenting, sorry, I'll just change slides. Whoop, how do I change these? Sorry, we're working across multiple systems here. There we go. Just use a space bar, Trevor. Yeah, just great. So our starting point, and really why we've called our book Learning Whiteness, is to acknowledge that racial domination is not predestined or natural, but rather it's made and it is learnt. So it's relayed, it's transferred, it's taken, it's taught, and it's taken in. We come to the work thinking with scholarship led by historians such as Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds, but also work by, for example, Bill Schwartz and Patrick Wolfe, whose work has shown how whiteness is a system that is historically contingent. It's formed and relayed through specific, but also crucially enduring interests of settler colonialism. And our focus for the book and for this presentation is about settler colonialism as shaped by the British project of settler colonialism. And of course, when I'm emphasizing that these systems are enduring, that is because the settler colonial project is not over. In fact, it's a structure that maintains and shapes countries like Australia, Canada, the US, and so on. So
you see, with family,
what I'm going to be arguing today is that education, and including within that higher education, has been central to the formations and relay of whiteness across its material, epistemic, and affective domains. So what do I mean by these three categories? The material relations of education, I'll be talking about these with respect to education's economic foundations in and resourcing of. The epistemic relations of education are perhaps things that we're becoming much more familiar around, pertaining to the education's knowledge structures and cognitive economies. For example, the ways in which whiteness is centered in curriculum and in processes of knowledge production. And thirdly, the affective domains relate to the ways in which emotional attachments in education create particular feelings around whiteness. For example, feelings of white defensiveness or white fragilities, which various scholars have explored. And this can be within pedagogic exchanges as well as the sorts of everyday institutional practices of higher education institutions. And to share with you right up front what my overriding argument is today is that education, and specifically higher education, has been central to the making and sustaining of global systems of higher education, of global systems of whiteness. And something that I'm really alert to in this series is that this is a series about global higher, it's a center for global higher education. You're interested in thinking about the connections, the transnational exchanges and connections, but also the kind of historical emergencies of these systems, not only in their national context, but beyond that. And so I think what analyses like what Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds' book shows around drawing the global color line are the ways in which whiteness as a system of domination was something that was connected through the British colonial project and had these transnational forces, if you like. And so I think there is an impetus to think with the transnational when we're trying to understand these systems of whiteness and how they shape and operate across different sites. So the first part of the argument is that education has been central to the sustaining of these global systems of whiteness. But the second, and this is perhaps our analytic contribution or even perhaps methodological contribution, is that we're trying to suggest that if we're going to understand those systems of domination, we must understand their workings in material senses, epistemic senses, and affective senses, right? So we need to understand how these interlocking forces constitute education. And I think one thing that we've been trying to push against is the kind of token or piecemeal responses to racism by actually separating out small aspects of any one of those domains. And actually what we're suggesting is to think about these things together and how they interact. Okay, so I'm going to start with talking about the materialities of higher education. Our work has been quite, informed by Cedric Robinson's landmark book, Black Marxism, in which he explores capitalism as and argues that capitalism is constitutively racial capitalism. So this is thinking with the idea that capital has always depended on the appropriation of land and the labor of enslaved, indentured, and dispossessed people. So thinking along these lines, differentiation and indeed dehumanization is at the premise of capitalist relationships. So capitalism conceives personhood in terms of property relation and labor value. If we think about designations such as worker, owner, landlord, and so on. And as Jody Melamed has written, capitalist accumulation requires loss, disposability, and unequal differentiation of human value. And it's racism, systems of domination, that enshrines the inequalities that capitalism requires, right? So this is an analysis that doesn't see class and race as separate, but thinking about these forces as interlocking, as producing the kind of unequal differentiations of human value that capitalist systems turn on. So how does this work in education? Well, we've been thinking about this across three axes. We can think about the ways of material production of education, of higher education, its sites and systems have been bound up in processes of dispossession and enclosure of both people and land. In the settler-colonial context, as I'll go on to describe, this is the foundational act of the settler-colonial project is the seizure of land and occupation of land. Education has also been produced through divided labor. Now there's much that's been written about how education leads to divisions of labor in terms of differentiated workforces and so on. But what we're trying to draw attention to here is also the divided labor that produces education itself. So it rests upon racialized forms of classed work, cleaning, building, administration, teaching, caring, and so on. And education also involves the extraction of value, for example, through material infrastructures and commodities, hierarchies of people and knowledge, and the valorization of educational assets, products, and outputs. So we're thinking that, within that domain of materialities, there's a number of forces that analytically we're suggesting needs to be examined more fully. So I just want to touch on a few examples of each, but I won't be able to go into any in great depth because of time, but it'd be fantastic to, in the discussion time, to hear if within your own context, if you've got some case studies or reflections that you can share to sort of flesh out some of the broad kind of features of the materialities of higher education that I'm drawing attention to. So the first around enclosure and dispossession, we're suggesting that the expansionist and extractivist projects of education systems under capitalism, the capitalization of land, buildings, infrastructures, require, in the settler-colonial context, racialized enclosing and dispossessing. And this is often done under the guise of access. So a fascinating case study that I encourage you all to go and have a look at is the land grabs that were occurring. A website is there which details the archives and investigations of how 52 universities in the US were established under land grants under the Morrill Act, which was a law signed in 1862 to broaden access to higher education. So universities received these grants traceable to that particular act, but these were Indigenous lands, right? So land was taken from Indigenous communities in order to establish these higher education institutions and under the guise of access as well. Sharon Stein, whose paper I've referenced here, is authored a really fascinating account of that colonial history of higher education into the present, and is trying to think through the ways that you know, what current forms of privatization are doing in similar ways. And actually, I've put the cover of Devarian Baldwin's new book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, which explores some of these ways that universities' roles as land developers and you know, expansion into local communities involves the those ideas of dispossession as well. Something that I'm interested in hearing more about, if anyone's done research on, because it'd be something that I'm quite interested in following up, is the infrastructures of ed tech that we're seeing at the moment in education. You know, there's this growth of the ed tech industry, but what about those physical infrastructures, the land on which some of these huge infrastructures are being built? So identifying what kinds of material extractions and dispossessions are involved in this industry that now higher education is so intimately entwined with. The second part of the materialities is about the divided labor that produces education. You know, and here think about outsourcing and subcontracting that goes on in higher education. You know, this is really a call to recognize the full political economy of work, which produces formal systems of education. For example, the labor that produces the materials required for universities to function, the production of textbooks, computers, data infrastructures, also the bricks, mortar and steel, the differentiated labor within education institutions, I think is something that scholars are starting to really think much more about, particularly some research that my co-author Jessica Gerrard has done in Australia about the racialized classwork of cleaning done in education systems. I've put a paper here by Mason Sukarai and Stuart Tannock, which I think is a fascinating and important account of the ways in which research is subcontracted and the hierarchies, racialized hierarchies involved in the research industry. So that's another example that I think is important for us to think about. I might just, well, I'll just mention it briefly. There's a Mario Moore is an artist who decided, having looked at the whiteness that adorned the walls of Princeton University in terms of all the portraits that were on campus, I think he really poignantly points out this divided labor of higher education, because he sees that there were so many white male academics on the walls of this elite institution that he decided to paint the blue collar workers who really run things. And I think this is a really evocative, I guess, example of that divided labor that we need to perhaps pay much more attention to in our research agendas when we think about inequalities in higher education, actually how higher education is constituted through those inequalities. And just very quickly, that third part of that examination of racial capitalism, thinking about the materialities of higher education, is how these systems extract value. So education's routinely thought of for the value they bring to states and also in terms of value they bring to individuals. So in this sense, we might see higher education as creating material value, but the lens of racial capitalism helps us to see how the production of value occurs through processes of enclosing and dispossessing and dividing labor. It's only through those other practices that the value of people, land and knowledges and labor and materials is extracted and made. At the heart of this extraction of value is a commodification of education itself. And I think there are a number of colleagues I've met today, as well as others whose work I'm aware of, who are looking at the ways that higher educational practices, are linked with that kind of commodification and extraction of value, and thinking about the use of data, the values associated with buildings, which I mentioned before, but also in terms of the accrual of status through university rankings and other sorts of metrics. And I'm aware that Riyadh Shahjahan and Kirsten Edwards I believe have come to speak previously to the Centre about their work on global university rankings and the ways that this is a way in which value is extracted through universities and the particular racialized dynamics of that. So I suppose here what we're saying is that we'd like to see a shift in the frame for seeing education not only as creating value, but the ways in which it extracts it, as that would make us more alive to those to the dynamics of racial domination in the sector. Okay, so going on to the second point, and I'm only going to touch on these briefly now because I think these are ones that are much more familiar to scholars in education. The second is thinking about the epistemic politics of learning whiteness in higher ed. And here we're saying that colonial and racial domination is not only a material force, but it's also about power and control over knowledge, over our understandings of ourselves and others, and over our past, presents, and futures. Reflecting on W.E.B. Du Bois's identification of the colour line as the defining problem of the world under a history of white supremacy, Sabelo Navolo Gatenshi observes that an epistemic line cascades from the colour line because, and this is a quote, because the denial of humanity through systems of racial domination automatically disqualified one from epistemic virtue. And I think here we're trying to understand these epistemic politics of learning whiteness as something that the movement to decolonize the curriculum, the student-led movement, which now has been sort of mainstreamed and institutionalized, perhaps as emblematic of this very series. So that sort of student-led movement is trying to engage in those very epistemic politics of learning whiteness. There's been quite a bit of backlash against it, charging it as being a kind of relativist position or even woke washing is the term I've recently heard. But actually, if we're thinking about whiteness in terms of its historical contingencies, what we see through the movement of decolonizing the curriculum and its connections to the epistemic politics of learning whiteness is that it's not so much a relativist argument about needing all sorts of knowledges and anything goes, but actually historically contextualizing the politics of knowledge production, addressing and correcting for the erasures, distortions, and interests of white domination that occur within the disciplines. Something I want to draw attention to here, though, is that these epistemic politics aren't just sort of abstract concepts, but they have profound material consequences. And here we're really inspired by the work of Indigenous scholar Aileen Morton Robinson in her book, The White Possessive, which the cover was a few slides previously. And she writes that it takes a great deal of work to maintain Canada, the United States, Hawaii, New Zealand, and Australia as white possessions. That is the enduring logic of settler colonialism, right? And she says the regulatory mechanisms of these nation states are extremely busy reaffirming and reproducing this possessiveness through a process of perpetual Indigenous dispossession, ranging from the refusal of Indigenous sovereignty to over-regulated piecemeal concessions. Thinking with Morton Robinson here, the sort of the great deal of work that is occurring to maintain these states as settler states what is happening in universities how are universities implicated in this through the kinds of erasures, distortions, and even kind of gatekeeping around disciplinary knowledges, and how that feeds into ideas that are made possible or ideas that are made silent within our halls of learning. So these are questions that we're trying to think with. I might skip over this in the interest of time, but just to say that we've been approaching these epistemic questions through the work of Charles Mills, whose work on the epistemologies of white ignorance has been really, really informative. So it's just to share some resources for those who are listening in. If you're interested in following up some of these ideas, the reference is at the bottom of this slide. And the final dimension that we have explored, so we've got the material, the epistemic, and then finally the affective dimensions of learning whiteness. And here we're suggesting that the production of affect is vital for maintaining material and epistemological dominance. And we're seeing this in a number of ways. I've listed 3 here that people might be able to recognize. And actually, talking about affect and identifying it analytically is really quite difficult, because on the one hand, we all have different understandings of what affect is, and there's lots of theories about the sociology of emotions and feeling and so on. So we've sort of been working across a number of different literatures and not sort of I suppose our method here in trying to understand the affective dimensions of learning whiteness is trying to understand what those narrative accounts are, the lived experiences of largely people of colour within white dominant institutions. So 3 sort of dimensions or aspects that we've been thinking about is the ways in which denial, defensiveness, and pride have been active feelings in the production of sort of closing down other ways of learning or knowing in institutions. So before that links back to the ideas of the production of white ignorance. And this is about, you know, how feelings can shape exclusions and distortions within university curriculum reform and within political discourse. And we see this time and again with the kind of very muscular backlash against thinking about issues of racism in schooling, the kind of attack against CRT, critical race theory in schools, and sort of the endless opinion columns in usually right-wing newspapers that are very emotionally charged against the kind of against addressing these sorts of the active histories of coloniality and racial domination that do shape our institutions. The other ways in which we're seeing the kind of relay of whiteness and the normalization of whiteness in higher education occur is through the positioning of people of color as emotional and irrational within institutions. There's been some really, I think, important, but also very moving accounts, and usually sort of biographical or oral history sort of accounts of what it means to be a person of color in a white dominant institution. There's work that I've referenced below by Nadina Doherty that I recommend you read, but also I think Sarah Ahmed's work has been quite formative in this space of thinking about affect in institutions. And the third area that we're seeing this kind of the affective economies, if you like, of higher education is the ways in which a sort of sense of comforting benevolence is invoked. So, and usually in regards to expanding, widening participation or access in higher education. So, and again, this is drawing on Sarah Ahmed's work, that whiteness allows some bodies and knowledges and feelings to be at home in institutions, while others are variously visitors, outsiders, or outcasts. So so it's one thing to let let others in the door, but then what does it mean to feel at home, to feel the comforts, right? And I'm, often think about this in terms of even institutional language of widening participation policy, and perhaps you have different terms used in your institutions, but ones that I've come across includes the non-traditional student. So there is a norm here, the normative student, the traditional student of places like this, Oxford, Cambridge, and so on. So who is the non-traditional student, and will they ever be at home here? So really part of our argument, thinking about the affective dimensions of learning whiteness, is that the redressal of racism calls for remaking affective relations across public cultures, interpersonal exchange, and within the institution of education itself. And these questions of justice are not simply about creating good feelings, feeling like you're including people in a kind of benevolent, what sort of comforting benevolence, because it's precisely through such appeals to, feeling that one is doing good, is that often the structures of racism are left untouched. Okay, so we're thinking really how this needs to still connect up to the material, to the epistemic. So just to conclude, and I'm sorry this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some quite kind of, I guess, broad areas of inquiry, is, if we're thinking about the material, epistemic and affective production of racism in higher education, and if we can identify the myriad ways in that this occurs, the question is then, well, what next? What do we do with all of this? And I think what it points to is that the piecemeal or tokenistic attempts to deal with systems of domination through appeals to inclusion and diversity often don't go far enough. Right. So what our main argument is that we need to work across these three domains: the material, the epistemic, and the affective. And there's something that Saidiya Hartman recently wrote, actually was part of an interview last year, that actually, I think, summarized part of our argument really clearly. She says the possessive investment in whiteness can't be rectified by learning how to be more anti-racist. And I think that's sometimes the easy response of institutions. Well, let's run a training day, or let's do some unconscious bias training and so on. Rather, it requires a radical divestment in the project of whiteness and a redistribution of wealth and resources. She goes on from her position as an abolitionist feminist. It requires abolition, the abolition of the carceral world, the abolition of capitalism. What is required is a remaking of the social order, and nothing short of that is going to make a difference. Now, I think this is an open question. It's an invitation really of, what would it look like to create a reparative agenda for higher education? Can we think about the work that is, the really important work that's going on with decolonizing the curriculum across different disciplines, working with teachers as well as those within universities? What does that look like if we think about it in terms of it being part of a reparative agenda, that we can see that there's something that that higher education has been constituted through relations of inequality, through systems of domination. So if we recognize that, then what kinds of questions around justice emerge that we might not be seeing if we simply focus on things like widening participation, access, inclusion, and diversity? As important as those things are, they aren't enough. So I'm going to stop there and leave it open with that invitation to perhaps hear from you about, if you're able to fill out any examples from your own context to think about in terms of the material, the epistemic, and the affective, but also this idea of what the reparative possibilities are for higher education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arathi. This is a really amazing and thought-provoking presentation. So we've got some questions in the chat. And first of all, I would like to invite Olga Mong to ask the first question. Olga, are you with us?
Yeah, hi, sorry, it's a bit noisy where I am, but hi, Arathi. It's so good to see you. I suggested you as a speaker for this series when David was planning it. So I have a question about the intersections of citizenship and race in this conversation, because the topic of my doctoral research is on epistemic injustice in the context of Kazakhstan. But when I actually ask questions about the epistemic injustice, some of the participants talk about epistemic injustice from, let's say, ethnic Kazakh men, more specifically. So it's very difficult for me to see how the conversations on race, for example, in the UK, in the US, they somehow shape the global conversations on race, let's say in post-Soviet context as well. But sometimes when you actually look at the context, let's say white people in Kazakhstan are in no way in the position of power. It's a local sort of, and there's this, I don't want to know this message belong, but there is this sort of interplay between nationalism and global white supremacy on so many levels. And I don't know how can we empirically grasp it, sort of in defining the privileges of the local community in relation to the proximity to whiteness, or how do we conceptualize these discussions in outside UK and US, right, where the dynamics of race and ethnicity have been different, yeah, it's a bit of a messy question, but basically, yeah, how do we think of it outside of the UK and the US?
Okay, thanks so much, Olga, and lovely to see you. Hope you've been well. I think what I want to emphasize actually is that our analysis was focused on the British settler colonial project, which is why we've explicitly taken up the question of whiteness, right? As because historians, sociologists, and really, I think that a pioneer in the field of whiteness studies was W.B. Du Bois, really talking about how whiteness was a kind of, in fact, a cognitive and deeply felt position that was taken up to justify imperial domination, right? So that was our starting point. But I think what you've rightly questioned here is how far this can translate to perhaps contexts that don't fit into that, the British settler colonial history. So here I would say, I mean, I can't answer empirically for, you know, the Kazakh context that you are speaking about, but I'm wondering if tools around racialization might be useful for understanding the ways in which groups are hierarchically ordered, that differences emerge as an outcome of struggles. I mean, from the point of Cedric Robinson, these would be that class struggles become forms of racialization. So this is why race and class can't be disentangled, right? That they're interconnected. So I'm thinking that perhaps it's not so much that whiteness becomes your locus of analysis, but in trying to understand how systems of domination work in that context, we're thinking about the process of differentiation and hierarchic ordering of human life. And that itself is what Omi and Winant would be calling processes of racialization.
Thank you. Need to unmute myself. Thank you, Arathi, and thank you, Olga. So now on the question list, there's Simon. Simon, would you like to come in quickly, please? It looks to me more of a comment. Simon, are you here with us?
Oh yes, Shin. Sorry not to come in. No, a great presentation. I mean, the only thought I had was in response to the, the overall framing of the problem. And it struck me that, you know, there's so much under material that maybe institutional, because we keep coming back to institutions, don't we? You know, might be worth using as a category, but you've got far further with this than I have, so I'll leave that to you. But one of the things that struck me about, you know, change and how it occurs, and I've been looking at global science primarily and looking at the exclusions, you know, from global science and how most of the world's knowledge is not there. It's how changes in the material realm, in the kind of resources and power and so on in the material realm, are not always reflected in cultural shifts. So you've got, you know, you've got a multipolarization of research and science and knowledge around the world, with universities everywhere emerging, developing considerably in the last 30 years. And at the same time, still got this Anglo-American blanket on knowledge, you know, where everything's in English and so on. You know, cultural change seems to be slower than material change sometimes. People have investments in these neo-imperial systems for a lot longer than you'd think those systems are lasting.
Yeah, can I clarify, what do you mean by cultural change there, Simon? Like, what
well, you know, affective is one dimension of that. You know, and people's notions of authority and power and hierarchy, institutional hierarchies of culture and language and so on. And these things are, seems to me to be, when we're surprisingly, you know, still in the world of the 1960s in lots of ways in the world university system, in terms of the authority and power that certain institutions, certain languages, certain disciplines, certain kinds of conversation have. Indigenous knowledge is outside it, you know, and so on. And, you know, this is, and yet the world has become, is no longer the Americanized world of the post-war period. You know, it's no longer 70% of R&D in the US and so on. So, you know, change seems slower in some domains than others.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe this is where the affective, the analysis of that comes in to play, because, you know, certainly in our looking at these issues in the Australian context, just tracing some of the backlash. I mean, in the media, it's sort of called the culture war and so on. But, you know, time and again, you see discourses of fear and a real anxiety over the loss of dominance. And I think that really closes down opportunities for more material or structural change, because you've got people fighting for actually something that protects the elite. And I think we need to kind of name that much more, that, you know, the fear of change, because that fear of change, if it is transformative, does mean that the elite might have their positions, our positions, I might say, under threat.
Because while we're having this discussion, The Economist this week has got a cover story which is all about the cancel culture, so-called, and the danger that represents to white liberalism, I think, is the sort of underlying theme. But you know, it's the effect of the way this debate is now being framed. It's putting every concern about racialization, everything about colonialism, all those sort of things are being pushed into this box, which is now being labeled unacceptable or illiberal or anti-democratic or exclusive, and being marginalized, you know, just as the anti-racial, anti-colonial argument starts to really eat into the mainstream. And I think it has been shifting considerably in the last 5 years. You've got this attempt going on, very well orchestrated, you know, from the populist Conservative Party type anti-cancel culture stuff right to a quite sophisticated level, you know, to put it all back in its box and to keep it under control and to restrict it. It's a very major amount of work going on at the moment to suppress concerns about racism.
So thank you, Simon. I think we will move on to invite another two sets of questions or comments from Stephan and then Jack Lee. So first of all, Stephan, could you, yeah.
Hi there, can you hear me? Great, yeah. Nice to see you, Arathi, and thanks for a very, very good talk. As you were talking, you preempted this at the end, but I was thinking, well, how does any of this apply in my own context in Denmark, but maybe in another huge education sector like that of China, when you're framing a part of your talk, at least around the notion of a global higher education. But then you made it quite clear that your starting point was looking at British settler society. And so then I guess this optique of whiteness is really important. It's a good way to try and explain some of these dynamics. But I think even in the Danish case, which is quite different, many of these things can still be seen. Not so long ago, I participated in a seminar at my own university with a speaker from Melbourne. And she started by explaining that if she was giving this talk in Melbourne, she would do as you did and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. And then she paused and asked the room, who would that be in this case? And this was a room of white middle-class Danish men. And one of them just said, you're looking at them. You know, so there's that notion in this country that nothing has been appropriated or stolen or misused. But I think once you start using some of your concepts, you can easily start to see in the ways in which you know, a so-called social democratic society based on very clear notions of justice and equality and so forth is still built on this really opaque foundation. So I was thinking, with your material category, we don't have really private institutions, and they weren't sort of the institutions we have, of course, have taken land that's been given to the public and used for public institutions, but increasingly universities have become private buildings. When I moved to Denmark 20 years ago, you could walk into any public building anywhere in the country because it was owned by taxpayers. But increasingly buildings are locked off, and I think that creates a mindset in the country that universities, even though they're public institutions, are no longer part of that commons. So that's an interesting thing that sort of transcends race, but of course is deeply connected to race, because there are certain communities in Denmark who are being told implicitly which spaces are public for them and which are not. So I think that's a good way to think as well. The notion of university labor is really pressing in Denmark. We tend to talk about divisions of academic labor between people in permanent positions, primarily being male, and people in temporary, more fragile positions being women and people of color. But we also have that amazing invisible problem that our universities are run in the sense of the site and the cleaning and so forth by minorities who are already marginalized in Danish society. So in my institution, I always try to get my students to do project work by observing and talking to the cleaning staff, because I'm running a program related to global humanities, and we tend to think you need to go to another country to study global dynamics, but they're in the corridors between 9 a.m. before 9 a.m. every morning. And then I think finally, in the Danish context, you can really look at the way that international students have been positioned. I mean, we're one of those countries where we don't really seek international students. Our university financing is not based or dependent on fee income from international students, but we have them, of course, for different reasons. But almost without exception, all of those groups are problematized. And whilst the university industry is not actively seeking them in great numbers, I think the state is, because they form a part of the low-wage economy. So many international students in Danish universities are part of the lowest part of the economic chain. And of course, that is a problem in itself, but white Danish students sitting alongside those people already have a different positionality when they look at their colleagues who are already abnormalized in Danish society. So in those ways, all of these issues are just as relevant for a country that's a long, long way from being a British settler society. So I took a lot from this that I could start thinking about projects and collaborations. It was just really, really good.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Stephen, for that that actually fleshing out some of the ways in which these ideas resonated in the Danish context. And actually your comment on the commons, you know, and the publicness of education is something that we've been trying to think about as a team, you know, behind the book. In the Australian context, a kind of appeal to public education, including in the university sector. But of course, this is public education on stolen land, and often, and it's precisely the kind, and if you're thinking about that as a starting point, then who's public and what are we understanding as the public? And it really changes the concept of the commons altogether. One thing I did want to just, as you were talking about the Danish context and expansion and so on of the privatization and so on, I wanted to think about branch campuses and just throw a question out there for anyone who's here. I'm really fascinated to know if there's been any analysis done of the expansion of branch campuses, but particularly around ideas of land, the appropriation of land, the buying up of land, whose land, who gets moved when universities decide to open up shop on offshore campuses and so on. So if anyone knows of research that's been done or projects that are in the pipeline, I'd love to connect with people who are doing that kind of stuff. Not sure if anyone wants to come in on that question or.
Yeah, I think the problems and questions about branch campuses is really interesting. And if you have like comments or thoughts, please feel free to leave that in the chat, or you can perhaps contact Arathi after the webinar. And next, I think I'll invite two audiences, Jack Lee and then Solomon, to ask their question, and then perhaps Arathi can take the two questions together.
Hello, thank you for a very stimulating talk. This is Jack from University of Edinburgh. I think particularly the earlier comment about the US and UK context, I think that's quite spot on. And I get that, you're writing in the context of the UK. Sometimes I think about, for example, Black Lives Matter and how Asian context would have any interpretation of that. But in thinking about the three different categories, I was wondering if you had any thought about, in higher education, which one could we perhaps have a more realistic chance of making some immediate impact? I think particularly about affective. I used to do a lot of work in intercultural anti-racism training, and certainly that's also problematic in itself. But your affective category makes me think about the immediate day-to-day interactions that people have, and perhaps we can change that much more quickly than epistemic or material. Just thought maybe if you have some thoughts on that.
Thank you. And then Solomon, please.
Thank you. Yes, Arathi, I was particularly impressed with your idea of epistemologies of ignorance, and I don't know, I'm putting in a very difficult question. I don't know how best can we fight back the epistemologies of ignorance that's very rampant in global higher, in Western higher education in particular. Ignorance as an activity or practice or process as theorized by Charles Meads, all the erasures, the denial, the self-deception, the obfuscation, mystification, idealization, is so powerful. Even a lot of people of color in the position of power buy into this. Just last week, so we have seen leaked email, in the US, where Veronica Wu herself, not white, I don't believe in Black Lives Matter. Okay, and if anything, I believe they're actually racists seeking to stir up trouble in order to push our country, that means the US, toward socialism and perhaps communism. Okay, so these are the epistemology of ignorance are so profound, so powerful, and a lot of people of color in positions of power who I expect would stand for, the cause of fighting against inequality, racial inequality, are even buying into them, and that the higher education system in the West probably is making a stronger case, a stronger argument that they're liberal, progressive centers of knowledge and excellence, far removed from any idea of racial discrimination. But I would strongly disagree with that. It's just like probably arguing like, I can't be sexist. I'm not sexist because my wife is a woman. It's just down to that. I mean, that is profoundly wrong. The evidence against Western global higher education, it's racism itself. It doesn't create racism. Your brilliant presentation is a good testament to that. So, how can we best fight, these epistemologies of ignorance?
Okay, thank you so much, Solomon and Jack. And I think probably your questions do speak to each other, because it's the what do we do question. Jack, we didn't, in sort of delineating the three relations or dimensions of education, material, epistemic, and affective, we were really, we were concerned that they would become separate things. And actually what we wanted to show is, and what we try to do in the book, perhaps much more successfully than in a brief presentation, is actually to try to show how they're interconnected, how one can inform the other, how, that one can condition the other, and so on. And in each sort of case study, you can see elements of all three working, right? So, so I'm not sure about which one's most important, or which one should we start with, because I think all three are operating all the time, right? That is what is constituting education, is what we're seeing. However, I will take your point that actually, if the affective can start at the everyday and the interpersonal and the institutional relations, that you might have within a school, within a university, then that might be a place of intervention. But the curriculum has also been a place of intervention. That touches on the epistemic and the kind of issues around ignorance that Solomon has raised as well. So I can see that there are opportunities for intervention across all three if we're going to separate them out, but they all depend on each other. So, thinking about the resourcing of any of those sorts of interventions around, whether it's anti-racist training, anti-racist pedagogies, or thinking about how far decolonizing the curriculum occurs within institutions, and what sorts of material buy-in or material kind of pressures there are against those. I think actually trying to think about all of these things together it's difficult, but I don't think what we're not doing is saying, therefore we shouldn't act, right? In naming the complexity, our argument is that we actually have to understand this complexity to understand how our actions and interventions might be circumscribed, but what their possibilities are, but where we might need to reckon with this failure and what we need to do next. I think it's this ongoing iterative thing, because I think I see a lot of sort of swooping in and training up the teachers and then we're done kind of like sort of interventions that actually don't acknowledge that complexity and the multidimensional nature of racial domination within sectors and institutions. And that itself is a problem. That is the perpetuation of those systems of domination, right? It's not just failure, it's actually active perpetuation of those systems. We're actually out of time, I can see that. So I don't know, I haven't actually gotten to your question so much, Solomon, but yeah, I think, I do want to honor the sorts of work that's going on by teachers and lecturers around the world around thinking about questions of epistemic justice and decolonizing the curriculum, because I think it's through that we're starting to have these conversations about how knowledge can, the problem of ignorance that has structured our institutions. So just to end with that acknowledgement and hope, perhaps. Okay, so.
Yes. So Thank you, Arathi, and thank you everyone for this really stimulating discussion and really brilliant presentation today. And thank you for all for posting your comments and questions in the chat area. I can see a comment from Bali and also comments coming from Lee and other colleagues. And so thank you everyone for coming. Our next CG webinar will be on next Tuesday and continuing the webinar series about racism and coloniality in global higher education. So until then, thank you, take care, and bye-bye.